Hello and welcome to Jason's Macintosh Museum. I'm Jason, your host, and what we're looking at today is, well, the original Macintosh. This is the Macintosh 128k from 1984. So this is probably the best known of all old Macintoshes because it was the very first one. And it was, in a sense, the very first affordable personal computer that was designed to use a graphical user interface. And if you think about it, the only other computer that came before the Macintosh that was sold more or less to the general public in reasonable numbers was the Lisa from 1983, although of course that didn't sell anywhere near as well as the Macintosh did. Now, in a sense, you could say that the Macintosh 128k is really a cut-down Lisa, because what Apple did when developing the Macintosh, the original Macintosh, was that they took a lot of the good features out of the Lisa and tried to incorporate that into a smaller and, crucially, a much cheaper package for the average person. Because even though the Lisa was technologically very advanced and had a proper graphical user interface, the issues that it had related mainly to the speed and also the price. The Lisa in 1983 cost around $10,000, 10,000 US dollars, which of course put it out of reach of almost everyone. But the Macintosh was different. Apple created physically a much smaller system that had, of course, far less memory. It only had 128 kilobytes of memory as opposed to the Lisa's 1 megabyte, but it had a very similar and, if anything, a more refined and cleaner graphical user interface. And as a result, the Macintosh was able to be sold for a much lower price. So the 128k, as you see here, was launched on January 24th of 1984. And I believe that was when Apple ran their Super Bowl advertisement, the famous advertisement with the hammer being thrown at the screen, and and I'm not sure what the ad was called. Not sure, but I'll put a link to the ad in the video so that you can see it. But I'm sure everybody knows about that ad. It's very famous, and it was this model was discontinued in October of 1985 when the newer model, I think it was the 512KE, came out. So what did you get with the original Macintosh? Well, you got a 8 megahertz Motorola 68000 CPU, you got 128 kilobytes of memory, you got a single 400 kilobyte single-sided 3.5-inch floppy drive, and you also got a built-in 9-inch black and white CRT screen. But the key, of course, was the graphical user interface, which made the Macintosh in its day, the original Macintosh, of course, one of the easiest computers to use. And remember that Microsoft Windows wasn't even available at that time. It didn't come out until about, I think, mid-1985. So, and of course, anyone who's used Windows version 1 or even version 2 probably knows how clunky it was compared to what the Macintosh had to offer back in 1984. So, the Macintosh, the original Macintosh, was certainly a great success, but there were some problems, and one of which was the philosophy at the time that Apple had, which is that the machine should more or less be a sealed unit, as in it was not designed to be expanded. And as a result, there was no provision for expanding the RAM, there was no provision for adding a hard disk, at least not initially, and even though you could add a second floppy drive externally, it was one extra floppy drive, and that's all you could have. And I think that was the real problem with the Macintosh in the early days, that People loved the idea of the machine, they loved the interface, they loved the fact that it was so easy to use, but they wanted a bit more processing power and a bit more memory and more storage. That was the key. Because it wasn't until, I think, at least a year after the Macintosh came out that they were able to offer the 800k floppy drives. And so 400 kilobytes per disk was, by the standards of the day, it wasn't bad, but of course, people, as they started working with more graphical applications and desktop publishing and that sort of thing, found the storage space was a bit limiting. And another problem that the original Macintosh 128k had, in fact, was a problem that was also shared by the 512k and the Plus, was that there was no built-in cooling fan. And apparently it was actually Steve Jobs who insisted at the time that the original Macintosh should be completely silent. In other words, no fan or any form of active cooling. So all that the original Macintosh 128k had was basically some vents in the top to allow warm air to rise out of the casing. But this did cause a problem, because given that the original Macintosh had a built-in CRT, all of the controlling circuitry for the CRT, such as the flyback transformer and the horizontal and vertical deflection circuitry, was all contained inside. And to add to that, you have the machine's logic board and the machine's power supply. So the older Macs, especially in fact the original 128s, did suffer from failures of the internal power supply circuitry, mainly due to heat. And the other main issue that the Macintosh faced in the early days was applications, in that there weren't many around for the Mac when it first came out. In fact, the main applications that were available for the Mac at launch were Mac Paint and Mac Write, and I think there were a few others, but the Mac certainly didn't have the huge range of applications that were available for, say, DOS at the time. And it did take a couple of years for that to change, certainly when desktop publishing was developed for the Mac with programs like PageMaker and the PostScript laser printer. That certainly helped a lot. But in the very early days, there wasn't really much that you could do with the Mac in terms of business productivity. And so some people really viewed the system as nothing more than a toy, unfortunately. So that's really all we can say about the original Macintosh 128k. So what we'll do now is have a closer look at it. Here's the front view of the Macintosh 128k, and you can see that it looks very much like other models of compact Macintosh. This, of course, being the very first one that was ever developed. It does, though, share its outer casing with the later models such as the 512k and 512ke. And in fact, even the original Macintosh Plus also had a very similar style of casing. So, looking from the top, we have the CRT. This is a 9-inch black and white CRT with a resolution of 512 by 342 pixels. And it was the same CRT that was used on the Macintosh models up to, I believe, the Plus. I think the SC had a slightly different CRT, but certainly this was used with the 128K, 512K, 512KE, and Plus. And then moving down from there, we have the floppy drive. This is a 400 kilobyte, 3.5-inch drive. Therefore, it is a single-sided drive, and so it only uses the bottom surface of the disk media. And then over from there, we have the Apple logo. Note that these older models of Macintosh did not, in fact, have any name or model on the front panel. That was all on the back panel. It wasn't until the Macintosh Plus was released that they started putting the model name on the front panel. Underneath that, we have the control, brightness control for the CRT, and then over on the right, we have the focus. We have the focus. Nope, that made it worse. There we are. We have the connector for the keyboard, because the original Macintosh 128k along with the 512k, 512ke and Plus all predated the Apple Desktop Bus protocol. So all of those machines had a front mount connector for the keyboard and a serial connector on the back for the mouse. So that's the front view of the Macintosh 128k. Now there's not much to look at on the side, so we'll turn it around and we'll have a look at the back. There we are. Oop, shift that over a bit. So here is the back view, and starting from the top we have the ventilation slots at the top to allow the warm air to escape from the system case. We also have the two screws up at the top here you have to take out in order to take off the back panel. We have the built-in carry handle, and here we have the actual Apple logo and the Macintosh nameplate. So notice that this being an original 128k, you only have the word Macintosh on the back. Now, for 128k machines that were built after November 1984, they would actually say Macintosh 128k. And they did this to differentiate them from the newer 512k that had come out at the time. Moving over from there, we have the cover for the built-in CMOS battery. So we can remove that like that. So that's where the CMOS backup battery would normally go. Unfortunately, I don't have one of those batteries to show you, but it's a, I believe it's a 4.5 volt alkaline, if I remember correctly, which normally sits in there. Actually, it says on the back of the case, use only, focus, use ever ready number 529 or equivalent. But you can't buy these batteries anymore, so normally you just run without it. And in fact, you'll notice that for some owners of these old Macintoshes, if you leave the CMOS battery in for a long time, it can start to corrode. You can see here it's actually started to corrode the terminals a little bit, but I'm sure we can clean that up. Below that is the main power switch. This Macintosh, of course, does not support soft power, so you turn it on and off with the switch on the back. Let's put that back in. And over here we have the model information, Apple Computer Incorporated, made in USA. That would have been probably in their plant in, I think it was Fremont, California. Model number M0001P, which indicates that it is an original first generation Macintosh 128k. And I think the P indicates that it's the 240 volt version as opposed to the 120 volt version, if I remember correctly. So going down from there, we have the copyright information there and the power supply information. Notice that it's only a 60 watt power supply. So that was the other issue that these older Macintosh models had. The power supply was sufficient to run the system, but over time, as the components aged, and certainly due to heat, they could certainly start to fail. Power supply input there. And then over here we have a lock for a security cable. And then we have, oh, I've already taken these screws out. There's a screw that's normally meant to go there, and a screw over here to secure the back panel. Then we have all the ports. So we have the mouse port here, and notice that it is not ADB. This machine is too old for that. So this is the same mouse connector that was used on the 512K, 512KE, and Plus. We have the external floppy drive connector here to attach an external 400K floppy drive, printer and modem ports, and note that they are not using the DIN 8, not the DIN 8, the DIN, is it DIN 8? I think it's DIN 8. the DIN8 connector that newer models use. These are the old DB9 connectors, but I believe these are still RS422 serial ports. And audio output. So that's the rear view of the Macintosh 128k. So what we'll do now is we'll take the back cover off and have a look inside. So the first step to taking the 128k apart is to remove the 4 screws holding the back panel on. There's 2 up here, one in there, and there are 2 down here. I've already taken those screws out, so to release the back panel, you should place it face down and then carefully tap. Well, you can use a special tool to spread the case apart, but normally I just give it a very gentle tap, and to release the front panel. Oh, there it goes. So the front panel is, the rear panel is now off. So here we have the internals. So what we have here is the CRT, the analog board back here with all the components for the power supply and for the CRT control. The logic board is over here, and so the next step is we'll take the logic board out and we'll start by taking off the insulation cover back here. Just lift that out, and what we now have is the logic board here. So to remove it, we have to unplug the connector from the logic board. There's 2 connectors here. There's a connector here for the power and video signal, and a connector here for the floppy drive. So we'll unplug let's carefully rock it back and forth to pull it out. There's the connector for the power and video, and floppy drive unplugs just like that. So we can now lift the logic board up, and you pull it all the way out, and the logic board is now free. So if you wanted to take the floppy drive out, what you would do is remove 4 screws here, 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 and here, and then the whole floppy drive bracket that you see here will come out. So let me do that quickly, and we'll take the floppy drive out. Okay, now that the screws have been removed, we can pull the entire drive bracket out of the system, just like that. So there's the 400k floppy drive. So if you wanted to go ahead and remove the analog board, you would have to undo a few screws. Let's have a look at where they are. There's 2 screws down here. You would then have to disconnect the CRT connector here, the deflection yoke connector over here, and the flyback HT connection here. And then you can pull, I think there's another screw, there's another screw over here as well to take out. And then you can pull the analog board straight out, but we won't do that here. What we'll do now is we'll have a closer look at the floppy drive and the logic board out of the 128k. Here is the logic board out of the Macintosh 128k. So let's have a look at what we have on here. So starting from the top, we've got some various logic chips. I think they're probably to do with the memory. So the various chips there. The original Macintosh tag and the 15 megahertz clock crystal. We've got the reset interrupt switches over here. Got the connector here for the power supply and for the video signal to the analog board. And then over here, in this area down here, we have the main memory. So we've got 16 chips, and each one of them looks like a 64 kilobit chip. And you notice that they're actually branded with the Apple logo. But I have to point out that one of them has been replaced, this one here, this NEC chip, because in fact this board did in fact have a bad RAM chip which I had to replace. And seems to be quite common on these older Macintosh boards in that the older lower density memory chips, especially the 64 kilobit chips that were used on the original 128k, do fail over time. And what you will find is that if you try and start the machine up, you'll get a sad Macintosh icon with a memory code error, which normally indicates a bad chip. But thankfully, the sad Mac error code can actually tell you which chip has gone bad. Notice that each row is labelled here, as in rows 5 through to 12, and each column of chips is labelled with a letter, F and G. So it's actually very easy to work out which chip has gone bad. The main CPU is here, the Motorola 68000 running at 8 megahertz, but this being a very early production board, it uses the older ceramic package 68000, not the plastic package. Unfortunately, I don't know if you can actually see what's written on there, but I can't tell actually myself, but that is the 68000 chip. The two ROM chips are here. And then, what else do we have? We've got the connector for the floppy drive here. We've got the IWM chip here, which is the floppy controller, known as the integrated WAS machine, that drives the floppy controller. That Zilog chip, not sure what, it's probably for the serial port. That's probably the serial port controller. And some other chips down here. Not much else over here. Probably the board's serial number there. And the original Apple computer tag, copyright 1983. So this was a original revision 1 128k board. Newer 128k boards that were produced alongside the 512k, in fact, shared a common layout, and you'll find that there will be a tag for 128k or 512k, and they'll print the revision number in the appropriate box. Looks like it's a 4-layer board. There's your keyboard connector. And that's really about it. So, for a machine that came out in 1984, that's actually a very well integrated logic board. When you compare it to, say, a computer like the Apple Lisa, which had several different boards that were all about twice this size in it, they really did a remarkable job of integration. Nowadays, of course, you could fit probably the whole system on a single chip. But, I mean, if you look at the Macintosh Classic, for example, which also has an 8 megahertz 68000, the board is about half the size and has probably about a third of the number of components. But even so, it was a very well integrated board. So that's the logic board. Now we'll have a closer look at the floppy drive. Here's the floppy drive out of the Macintosh 128k. And notice that it looks a little bit different from the newer 800 and 1.4 megabyte drives that newer models of Macintosh had. This was in fact the original drive, so it's only 400k and it is only single-sided. In other words, it only has one read head that reads the lower surface of the bottom surface of the disk media. So we can see that it's a Sony, what is that, a Sony OA D34V-22, made in Japan. And so looking at the top, we've got the single read write head there, and all you have on the other end is a pressure pad that actually is just there to maintain pressure on the disk as it spins. So one read write head there, and you can see that this huge motor here is actually the stepper that moves the read head back and forth. So it's mounted on a small worm drive or a thread, as you can see there, that moves the head back and forth. And this motor at the back is in fact the eject motor. So this little motor here, so it's designed to obviously provide quite a bit of torque. See, it goes through a, looks like a reduction gearbox, and then attaches to that lever which actually pulls on the eject mechanism. That's actually the emergency eject or manual eject lever there. So underneath, well, not much to see there, you can't really see the actual drive motor. That's hidden by the PCB there, but it says, well, the date of production, August 1984. And the back, you've got the connector there for the interface. So that's the floppy drive out of the Mac 128k. So in the next video, I'll reassemble the 128k, we'll start it up, and we'll show some old Macintosh software. So hope you enjoyed the video, and thank you for watching.